Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Particularly excited about today's lecture. In our previous lectures, we've done a lot of survey of music history and covered a lot of time period, sometimes hundreds of years, especially in talking about our old world traditions that are coming and establishing folk music, for example. But in comparison and in contrast, today we get to talk about a very small slice of time. And I'm only going to go backwards three or four decades to give us a little bit of context. But today we're going to be talking about surf rock music. And surf rock or surf pop as a genre was really only popular for 3 years in the 1960s. And in comparison to some of our explorations of larger topics, we're going to hone in on some specific genres that emerged from this particular subgenre of rock. And really get into some of the fun details of it. As always, I've prepared lecture notes for today. Let me go ahead and share them with you, just so we can get an idea of where we're headed. So here we go. Today's lecture, like I said, California Dreamin'. We're talking about surf rock in the 1960s. And to give us an idea of the directions that we're headed, in our first part, we're going to discuss very briefly the history of rock. And that takes us back to the late 1930s, 40s, and 50s into setting the stage for the 1960s. We talked a little bit about the emergence of rock, or rock as a genre, in our introductory lectures. But in this case, we're going to like I said, get into a very small subsection of a very large genre. First part, we're going to get some history and context of rock and roll, or more specifically, just rock. And in our second part, we're going to turn our attention to one of the two main categories that surf rock branched into. It branched into a very strongly vocal tradition. The Beach Boys are the most emblematic of that particular style. And then we have an entirely instrumental genre that emerges as well. And what makes that particularly notable is instrumental music without a vocal component was really only popular previously in the big band era, the really strong in the 1930s. So it had been 3 decades since we had had a interest in listening to purely instrumental music that was categorized in a popular music style. And that made certainly surf rock different than the other subgenres of rock, which really do incorporate a strong lyric component. In part 2, we're going to talk about instrumental surf rock. In part 3, we're going to talk about lyric surf rock, which then branches out into our discussion of part 4, which is what different offshoots and subgenres are there of surf rock, and when did it experience its decline, why, and when did we hear its revival. So that's our kind of general layout for today's lecture. Like I said, we're going to begin by talking about the genre of rock so that we can kind of orient ourselves. I've got a really wonderful documentary that I'm going to play a good slice of that discusses the emergence of the genre, which really owes a great gratitude and debt to the blues, which we will talk about later when we talk about music of the South and what's happening in that unit next. So without further ado, let me go ahead and pull up our documentary.
The classic rock genre has its roots in the music of the 40s and 50s.
Late 1940s, 50s rock and roll. So everything is built off of Carl Perkins, Ike Turner, Elvis Presley. But I think the 50s, like I wouldn't look at 50s rock and roll and say that's classic rock because it's old. I would say that's rock and roll that comes from rockabilly. Do you know what I mean? It has its own place and its own feel to it.
In the music of the classic rock genre, there are all kinds of influences. Samba, reggae, soul, R&B, rockabilly, bluegrass, doo-wop, Motown. It goes on and on. But there are 7 primary influences, which most of the music of the classic rock genre is based off of.
And in particular, there's a bluesy type of scale called the pentatonic scale. And that is really critical in the music of classic rock.
The single biggest foundation is the blues, and in particular, the pentatonic scale.
Well, your basic blues minor.
So just to talk briefly about a pentatonic scale, 5 pentatonic. So we're dealing with 5 notes. And to give us a point of comparison, most of the music of the classical canon that we, or even in popular music, more largely use the major mode or inclusion of more than just 5 notes. But in my initial, or rather my second lecture where I talked about harmony, functional harmony, the example that I gave, do a deer, contains 7 notes. So pentatonic scales have a slightly more restrictive vocabulary. And what that restriction does is it places the overall range of a particular tune in a smaller sort of box. And in doing so, it helps more people be able to sing it, to be able to perform it. And when we're talking about early memorability and passing down songs being, or music, oral traditions, that's going to have a major impact on why that construction is used. So what's also particular, and the video will continue discussing it, is the inclusion of often a blue note. And the blue note is a flattened third that gives the blues that particular sound. I'll go ahead and pull our video back up.
Pentatonic scale would be the root, the minor third, the fourth, the fifth, and then the 7th, flat 7.
Why don't you show me?
I hate that guitar. All right, classic rock is never played on a nylon string guitar, but since our illustrious documentary man owns one, here's your A pentatonic scale. I made it sound a little more interesting than it is, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes, and here's your octave, which is not considered an extra note in the scale. So there you go.
And that's the pentatonic scale, essentially.
Yes.
So that's the root of classic rock, you could argue, essentially, right?
Yes, especially this, when you do it up an octave and then you fool around with it, but I refuse to do that on this guitar because the strings feel like worms. Pentatonic.
The pentatonic scale is the foundation of the classic rock sound, exemplified by bands such as Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin.
If you hear anyone from Stevie Ray Vaughan, Muddy Waters to B.B. King, there is that pentatonic sound of that scale, which is in essence what blues is. Anyone, my dad or my grandmother, would hear a note and go, well, that sounds bluesy, and that is that essence. So I think even when you're talking about a band like Rush, from Led Zeppelin to Yngwie Malmsteen, when those guys start to shred, they are still in that box of that pentatonic world that is in essence the blues scale and the foundation of blues music.
Well, if you look at those bands that you just mentioned, say Zeppelin, go back a little bit further from Zeppelin to the Yardbirds, to the Stones, even to the Beatles and the Kinks. This is where the rock thing, the hard rock thing that you're talking about began. And it was born out of the blues. Without Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters, for instance, Led Zeppelin wouldn't have had some of their biggest hits. The Rolling Stones might not have had not only their hits, but the name of their band. Rolling Stones came from a song that was popular from Muddy Waters, his song, Rolling Stone. Their song, Satisfaction, was basically a reworking of his theme, I Can't Be Satisfied. Rock came out of the blues. It came directly out of the blues.
The blues influenced everybody in the rock and roll, without question. It gave the electric guitar with distortion a blues feel. It gave Eric Clapton the ability to hit a note and make it sing. And it gave all the vocalists something to work from.
Something like that. How does that go? That one.
But the roots of all music certainly goes back to the classics and the classical composers. They were the ones that really developed what we know now as melody and arrangement and dynamics.
I would agree wholly that the blues underpinning, that's the departure point to all of rock. Very American-based influences started rock, but the introduction of outside influences, and particularly classical music, those are important elements that kind of found their way in.
You can definitely hear the difference between rock from Europe as opposed to rock from America. It does sound different. At home in America, people grew up listening to blues and jazz. At home in Europe, people grew up listening to classical music, studying classical music.
And I think the first time that I really fully noticed that, probably the Revolver album of the Beatles. The first time I heard string quartet in Eleanor Rigby, that is, Eleanor Rigby is an entirely classically kind of underpinned piece of music.
The one you're painting is where Ringo lived?
No, John.
John lived here and Ringo lived downstairs?
No, Ringo never lived here, he just owned it.
Oh, okay.
John rented here and downstairs.
Classical music is a very European, British type of influence on the story of classic rock. And the same can be said for skiffle music.
The single most important person that a lot of folks haven't heard of when it comes to not only blues but rock and roll. There was a fellow named Lonnie Donegan who kind of invented skiffle music in Britain and was the biggest influence on the Beatles.
It became rock and roll. It was the sort of roots of rock and roll in England, but probably not in America. In America, I don't know where it came from.
Jazz has been an influence on major rock drummers. They're not playing just a steady beat. They're playing all over the place, which is what jazz drummers do.
On the drums, a local boy just like us. Mike Portnoy on the ground, John!
They're playing an improvised beat, which is complementing what they're hearing. The other musicians, they're reacting. So a lot of these guys When rock started out, that's what they were doing. They were reacting to what they heard the guitars or the vocals or the bass doing. And that's what jazz did. Mitch Mitchell and John Bonham, even Charlie Watts. You got to remember, Charlie Watts was a jazz drummer before he joined the Stones. And he still is a jazz drummer to this day. He plays in one of the biggest rock bands ever, the Rolling Stones, right? So, I mean, that's the concrete evidence that jazz has, as far as drumming, influenced heavily rock music.
In classic rock, the traditions of learning how to be a good percussionist, that element's being pulled up from jazz. It includes the voice as well. The voice is also an instrument. So when you're listening to rock music, you listen to the lead singers of rock bands. Their voices are really exploring the extremes of the voice's ability.
One day, we believe in rock and roll. So try to stay there.
So rock players have utilized that concept, if you will. The influences of jazz come through. So I'll give you an example, like a song like Stairway to Heaven. In the beginning intro of it, there's that descending line, and at some point it falls into an F major 7th chord, which essentially is a jazz chord, right? So there's the harmonic influence of jazz in a song like Stairway to Heaven, which is sort of a song that everyone knows.
Church music.
So before we leave the topic of jazz music, I want to sort of highlight and reiterate two different things. One is that we have a major divergence in musical tastes, with the establishment of the 13 colonies. We already touched on that with Old World transplants, this idea that large waves of immigrants are bringing over music that was popular in those specific regions, but the one major European import that really falls out of favor is classical music. And I use classical as a broad-reaching term. It's really instrumental music without vocalists that's played by ensembles like orchestras, for example. So as a result, having a more established folk music tradition in the United States and a instrumental orchestral tradition in Europe is going to set the stage for two kinds of waves of development. And what's interesting that happens in the United States is, of course, waves of migration are going to bring a multitude of different musical genres. The one that emerges that ends up being a major figure and point of connection for rock music is going to be jazz music. Now, jazz music ends up being wildly popular in New York City in the 1920s and 30s. I'm not saying that it didn't catch on in Europe, but not like if you were to go out and hear music in Manhattan on a Friday night in the late in 1927, for example, the ensembles that you would hear would be jazz music, and in contrast, you would have a much different musical experience if you were to do the same thing in Europe. Specifically, what happens in the genre of jazz is that we have a number of, like our speakers had said, drummers that were particularly gifted in their craft and are not just keeping the beat, so to speak, but really being a dynamic instrument of their own. And so therefore the divergence of jazz into a more rock medium is going to, like, the thing that's going to be most influential is two things. One, percussion, the drum set and how it's used, and then two, harmonies and what we call extended harmonies. The last guy was talking about the F major 7 chord in Stairway to Heaven. What that is an an F chord is something that we would hear, commonly, but a seventh is something that's an additional note that adds a little bit of tension that's more often used in the jazz medium. So we're going to hear harmonies that are used more often in jazz, in rock, and the harmonies that are used in orchestral music at the time are going to influence what's happening in popular music there. So we have some interesting points of divergence. I'm going to go back to our video one last time, talk about some other influential factors on rock music.
Early rock singers, Sam Cooke and Marvin Gaye and whatnot, that were getting hit records were gospel singers.
Yeah, I think real rock and roll was born, with Elvis and Bill Haley and Little Richard.
Little Richard was somebody who learned what he learned from church, and all of his shtick on the piano and his dancing around and the warbling, all of that are things that he learned when he was in church. That kind of flat out, they call it flat-footed singing, the surge singing. So whether you're singing with these long drawn-out notes, but also the power. People like Mahalia Jackson were definitely, and Clara Ward, these are the people that influenced, like Mick Jagger, and they would listen to what was going on and then emulate it.
Folk music is another key component of the musical foundation of classic rock, exemplified by artists such as Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, especially coming from the folk music scene at Washington Square Park. But we'll expand on that a little bit later in the film.
The people that would say that the blues are the biggest influence on it are probably right, ultimately, but to me the close second place would be country. The blues and country have always had this kind of like little dance going on, of like influencing each other. And certainly with rock and roll, I think, you look at some of the early big hits of rock and roll, and they were very country influenced. A lot of Elvis's records, the Everly Brothers, Chet Atkins produced those records. And then the Beatles covered Buck Owens songs, So clearly country had a big influence on the evolution of rock and roll.
In Middle America, Bob Seger was part of it. It was a different rock movement. Cheap Trick was a Midwestern, the archetype of a Midwestern band. Nugent was Midwestern. These artists were selling bucket loads of records, and these people remain stalwarts of classic rock.
There are 7 primary musical roots of classic rock: blues, classical, country, folk, gospel, jazz, and skiffle. There are other influences as well, but these are the central 7.
And this is probably where I'll stop the video. I'll argue that country, while it is, I wouldn't say that it is the root of classic rock. It has an existence alongside of rock and influences it by its existence simultaneously in a musical timeline sort of sense. Gospel, however, that was touched on that first part of the last segment, is something that we're going to take a detailed look at in our next lecture, which indeed focuses on the history of gospel music, looking back into the 17th and 18th centuries as setting the stage for that development. But as we heard, it's really the blues that is going to lay the ground for rock. And rock in the 1950s, starts shattering into other different identifiable subgenres. And it's a quick decade that leads us into the 1960s, which is where we're going to start our investigation, talking about surf rock. And one of the themes that we have seen is that location has an impact on the musical community that we are taking a closer look at. And in this case, the particular location of, California, Southern California, coastal Southern California, beach community, Southern California, is going to influence this particular subgenre of rock that is surf rock. So I am going to put a bow on our part one. Part two, we're going to define surf rock and take a look and listen to some hits that were a part of the instrumental subfraction of surf rock. So I will see you for part two shortly.